Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
In addition to everything else that happens in this episode, with all of the characters, one topic that was not looked at from a halachic perspective, a perspective of Jewish law, but is a topic that has what to say in Jewish law, which is what we were learning about earlier with the New Orleans folks, is about sort of male fertility testing and the halachic challenges, possibilities, etc., related to that. But as we saw in the episode, it's there's the a halachic piece of spilling seed. There's a general prohibition, which the Zohar and the Code of Jewish Law say is the worst prohibition in the world you can ever possibly do, of spilling seed. And spilling seed levatala, or not. And so the question becomes, what about when it comes to fertility testing? Is that considered zera levatala? Is that spilling seed for not? Or, even if it's not directly for a procreative purpose, it's indirectly for a procreative purpose. It's for the purpose of testing so as to be able to hopefully have children, right? So, there's a lot to say from a halachic perspective about that. I think all poskim, all decisors of Jewish law say it's permitted and encouraged, though they do say, it's preferable if it's done, this sort of the semen is collected through the course of natural intercourse, like, for example, using a condom. My dad's making faces. Like having sex with your wife and using a condom and then taking that versus, going to the bathroom like Amir does on his own, like Rav Moshe is like, no, don't do that. Though I guess if there's no other option, that's better than nothing. But, they say it's much preferable to sort of have, get the semen that you need for, so Renee says, what's the difference? Either way, sperm is spilled, which is true. The difference, I think, is that there's sort of there's a lot of conversation in the Talmud and rabbinic thought about what they call sort of adultery by way of, the hands or feet or limbs or so forth. And so it's seen, I can pull up if people are interested. Okay, so this is from Rav Moshe in his tshuva on the topic, right? He says, in our case, since he is permitted to have sex with his wife, we should not do this, extract the semen, through having sexual thoughts about a woman or with warm bread on the anus, which is what the Talmud talks about in a similar case of trying to get the man's semen, but rather by having sex with his wife. And if it's better for the testing of the semen that you wear a condom when they have sex, that's preferable. Or to the other methods mentioned, which include, for example, sort of having sex and pulling out and spilling that seed into a cup. He says that's better than going into the bathroom and having sexual thoughts about, generally, but there's sort of a hierarchy of possible ways of collecting the semen. And he says if the condom, Rabbi Schatz.
Can I just make one comment? You're doing great, but can I make one comment?
Of course.
Okay. Also, I'm just impressed that you're doing this with your parents in this class. I don't know that I could do that. So Debbie...
A few people could.
Debbie, but they're great, so that's why he could do it. So Debbie said the sperm would die. So there's actually a specific type of condom, kind of colloquially known as a kosher condom, that could be used in this way. I will say that when I looked it up, because I had never heard of it before I did this research, when I looked it up, it does not look like many people are using this, but like in the ultra Orthodox communities, if they don't want to go into a clinic and giving a sample in that way, that they can actually use this type of condom that doesn't have any spermicide in it and actually allows for some of the sperm to enter the woman, but can still be removed and keep some of the sperm that can be then taken to a lab. So everything that I found based off of that method, I guess, is that it could work. There's also a chance that it wouldn't work, same as what Rabbi Pernick was mentioning in terms of like just having sex, and the screen going on and off is very distracting.
So I put the screen back on because I saw Denise's question in the chat, which is exactly what the last paragraph of Moshe says. He says, don't do this in the doctor's office. Very bad. Don't have sex in the doctor's office to collect sperm, to collect semen. So that was just added to respond to Denise's question in the chat.
That's okay. Great. I don't know what else I was going to say. So that's
yeah.
Debbie's question maybe about this or comment?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, there's a limited amount of time that sperm can survive. And if you notice that when he took his little cup and hit it, they're like, come back in an hour. And, within an hour or so, I mean, they're going to have sex in the middle of the night and then hang on to it till the morning, the sperm will all be dead.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's what you meant by sperm will be dead. Yeah, I think that what they're basically suggesting, at least in the articles that I read, which, by the way, when you're picking random topics like this and you go down rabbit holes of articles, it is very interesting what people have time to write about.
I'm also just worried about what ads I'm going to start getting. That's my concern. Anyway.
Yes, and that. I had not thought about that.
Rabbit holes. That's what you were saying.
I wasn't talking about rabbit holes.
No, you were talking about the rabbit holes that you find of what people talk about. I was trying to get you back on your train of thought. No?
Oh, that what they say in these articles is not that they would be having sex in the middle of the night, but rather, they would try to have sex either in the morning before they go to the clinic, or basically what we're talking about here is that having sex is a better method of collecting sperm than it is through the means of like masturbation or going into a doctor's office, right? That those are not the halakhic ways. And so making sure that you can have sex to collect the sperm to then bring it. But yes, you're right that the timing, they do go into the timing factor of doing that. And all modern, especially liberal Jews are not doing this. They're saying go to a clinic and have it done in a way in which the doctor can then just take the sample and do the testing, that is more important than this idea of it being zera levatala, which is not what it is. It's not, you're spilling seed, you're using it for the means of procreation.
I was just going to note one additional thing on the topic, which is interesting, right? The origin of the prohibition, as it's described in the Talmud and in the Shulchan Aruch, is from the story of Judah's sons in the book of Genesis, right? And the understanding, at least of the Talmud, is that both sons died for the same sin, which is to use the Talmud's terminology, threshing within and winnowing without, right? The threshing on the inside, winnowing on the outside, right? So it's interesting that in the like Rav Moshe, where he's saying that's actually, right, that's much better than, say, like masturbating, right? Because actually the origin of the prohibition is sort of within the context of a sexual activity and then sort of, the man pulling out and releasing the seed elsewhere. So I just thought that's interesting that even though that's the origin of the prohibition, that's not seen as like the worst thing. It's sort of seen as a preferable option.
Before we go much deeper into this conversation, because I meant to say this before, but Rabbi Pernick went, from 0 to 100, and it gave a really good overview before we get a word in.
As I do, yeah.
Yes.
0 to 100. Not the...
Hey, something we agree on. That I want to just point out, not to get like serious for a second, but I do want to point out that this show makes this all seem very easy and very like rainbows and butterflies, and you can just go to a clinic and find out that everything's fine, and now they're going to have sex and they're going to have a baby. At least that's what the show is making you kind of think is going to happen. And I just want to point out, I know we talk about this in my congregation quite a bit, that like infertility is a really sensitive subject and something that people deal with for all sorts of reasons. And being able to go to a doctor and have tests done and being able to find out if you are in need of some kind of medical intervention or different lifestyle choices, whether halachic or not, to make sure that you can get pregnant is a real thing. And I wanted to, I don't know if Rabbi Pernick was going to say that, but I just wanted to say that having this conversation and having it through the form of a show, there's obviously things we are not talking about, but one of the pieces that does come up, and I see it when talking to couples who are going through these struggles themselves, that there's that blame factor of, well, do you think it's really just me because I'm the woman, and of course it's my fault, right? I didn't ovulate correctly, or we didn't count correctly, or whatever. And then he goes and has this test done and finds out that everything's fine, and he wants to celebrate, and that's hard for her. And that makes sense, because now what is she thinking? Whether or not it's true, she's thinking, well, so I must be the problem. And so I just wanted to point this out from the beginning, that this is sensitive, that this is something that people should be getting help, medical, rabbinic, if you want it, counseling, all of those kinds of things if you are dealing with infertility with you and your partner, and that it's not as easy as just what they do on this show, and that there are people around to be able to help with that, and that we will talk about it as sensitively as we can, but I wanted to make sure that that was put out there first.
Okay. Dad.
Well, so, as Rabbi Schatz just said, this is a very common occurrence, and we know that, like in America, they say basically 1 out of every 5 couples has infertility issues. So this is a very, very common issue. But what I wanted to also just add is this was a part of the show where I was disappointed in Amir, who's really one of my favorite characters, because when, he's so depressed and he's so down and everything's sad. And once he gets his test results, it's like, it's happy time. But he has no sensitivity for his wife, because it's kind of like, okay, it's not me, it's you. I mean, he's not directly saying that, but I was very disappointed. I understand from a personal point of view, he's going to be happy that it's not him. But given his feelings for Yifat, I was disappointed in his lack of sensitivity towards her.
Yeah, I agree. He's also one of my favorite characters, if not my favorite character. And
once again, we agree. So
yeah, see? I knew there was a Rabbi Pernick out there that would agree with me. And I think that, to give him the benefit of the doubt, at least, I think there's something, maybe he was actually feeling stressed about the fact that it could have been his biology that was not allowing them to have a baby. And so now he's happy that it's not. And I just wish that there had been, as you said, a little bit more sensitivity towards what it sounds like when you say, let's celebrate, right? Even if he's not insinuating that it was her, what it seems to mean is that it's not me. So anything I do now is not going to be the problem. It's going to be someone else, something else, whatever it is. I agree. And I think that over the past few episodes, at least this is what Rabbi Pernick has been saying, and I kind of agree with him, is that he's been kind of missing the mark in a few ways in this relationship. He's not really so sure how to navigate. People have social anxieties and awkwardness. I feel like he has marriage anxiety and awkwardness. He doesn't really know what he's supposed to be doing with Yifat, and especially in this moment where he could have been a little bit more sensitive, he really wasn't.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go out of order and call on Jeff because he has a great shirt on. So, Jeff.
Oh, I just had a question. At the end of the show, when he took the pregnancy test out of the trash, did we know what it was? What it said? Could we see that?
Yeah, it was negative.
Oh, it was negative.
It was only one line.
Yeah. I love that all the women knew that. Yeah, it was a negative test.
I thought it was a positive test. So, okay.
Oh, we should have told you it was positive. No, it was negative. And I think that was actually the moment where what your dad just said kind of actually flipped for him, where he realized that he had been lacking a little bit of that sensitivity that he probably should have shown in the moment, because he saw that she still was not pregnant, even though there's nothing wrong with him. She still wasn't pregnant.
Yeah. And again, great shirt, Jeff. Okay, Debbie and Steve.
He still hasn't heard you, but it's funny that you keep saying it.
Two things. One, as people are older now when they get married, we see the age of marriage going up. There are more issues with infertility because women are born with a certain number of eggs, and that's all they got. Men can just keep making that sperm. So the issue sometimes with infertility, some women use donor eggs, and how is that looked upon halakhically?
Do you want to take it?
You want to go? Or you want me to?
You can start. I'll finish.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of conversation in Jewish law about both, donor eggs, as well as now, why am I blanking on the term? Having children through surrogacy, through surrogacy and things like that. So all of these things are, they're permitted by Jewish law. The question becomes on sort of all sides of the question, there's a question of the Jewish status of the child. So if it's donor eggs from a Jewish woman and the child is, and the baby is, and the eggs are within a Jewish mother, then there's no problem. But on either end, whether it's, surrogacy or donor eggs, if the carrier or the egg donor, as it were, if either of them is not Jewish, then there's issues related to, conversion, which is not a big, it's a conversion at, right as soon as possible after birth, usually as part of a bris for a boy or, a ceremony for a girl. So those questions come up. But beyond that, certainly for women who are unable to have children with their own eggs, using either donor eggs or surrogacy are absolutely viable halachic options.
There is a question, though, about IVF in terms of it being similar to kosher food, it being watched and therefore known to be, egg meeting the correct sperm as opposed to sperm from a non-Jewish man somehow meeting the egg of this Jewish mother. So again, one of these articles that I read talked about how for some very frum couples, they choose to actually have the rabbi or chaplain around present when the actual contact is made between egg and sperm. And had you not heard of that? Is that why you just did that with your head?
Yeah.
And so that's another piece of this, that there's a lot to be said for kind of the watching process, and how controlled of an environment it's done in. But as Rabbi Pernick was talking about, that's more, if you're dealing with an actual egg where it's coming from a certain mother or going into a certain woman's body. But I just wanted to add the IVF piece in.
There's also a lot of conversation and challenges. From my understanding with IVF, typically multiple fertilized eggs are inserted into the mother. Right? Is that correct? Yeah.
I believe.
But
I believe so. I don't.
So right. So from my understanding, typically multiple fertilized eggs are put into the mother's uterus, because typically not all or many of the fertilized eggs won't end up, becoming viable. That does create problems halachically, sort of like abortion style questions about, are you allowed to, eliminate a fertilized egg? If they inserted 3 and all 3 are viable, start becoming viable, right? There's all kinds of things that medically typically are done so as to, a lot of people have IVF twins, right? That's very common. But there is certainly a lot of halakhic conversation on that topic of whether that's permissible to eliminate a fertilized egg before it becomes sort of a viable fetus.
The only other halachic thing that I will mention that has nothing to do with this part of the process, but just in general, is what some people call halachic infertility, which sometimes is affected by the way a woman is counting if she's practicing Hilchot Nida. So without getting into too much of this, since it's not exactly the topic, the way in which a woman might be counting after she has her period before she can go to the mikvah, if the period was longer than expected and then the counting goes longer than expected, it's possible you can miss an ovulation window. And so that's another piece of infertility in the Jewish world that comes up sometimes even before medical intervention. You would go to a rabbi or someone who is close to you that is knowledgeable in the topic, and you would say, we're having trouble conceiving. Here are all the things we are doing. If we are practicing Hilchot Nida, here are the ways we are counting. Can you help us with this? And I actually had a situation when I was working in Northern California where a couple came to me, asked me these questions. I didn't know enough of the information. I called Rabbi Pernick. I was passed around the Beit Midrash, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, met a lot of rabbis, and spoke about these random people to a lot of people, and got an answer from someone. I don't remember whom.
It's either of Lindsay or of Yonah, I feel like.
I think it was, yeah, okay. I don't remember. And I spoke to all of them, but I don't remember who the answer came from. And ultimately, it came down to this idea of halachic infertility in terms of how they could be counting and how she could be kind of manipulating, maybe is not the right word, but working around things with her period to make sure that the next time she ovulated, they were actually able to have sex. So that's another halachic piece in this system.
Just, one brief note on that. So typically the standard way that Nida is practiced, at least in the Orthodox world, is that it's 5 days plus 7 days, right? Women, it's a 5-day period from the time the first appearance of blood. You wait 5 days and then start counting 7 days after 5 days. So that makes a 12-day total period of time that a woman's in Nida every month.
Unless her period is a different length of time.
Unless it goes longer, and then it's longer. But even if it's shorter, we don't typically go less than the 5 before the 7, typically, right? So from my understanding, for most women, that ends up meaning they come out of Nida right around their prime fertility time. But every woman is different, and there are cases, and that's, as Rabbi Schatz talked about, what's sort of often referred to as halachic infertility or orthodox infertility or things like that are actually women who, because of the nature of, as Rabbi Schatz talked about, because of the nature of that typical way that we observe Nida, it actually ends up that the woman's still in Nida at the time of prime fertility. So, yeah, exactly. But that's because of the way
Orthodox infertility is not a nice term. I think halachic.
I saw that online, so halachic infertility is how I always heard about it. But I saw something that's
Orthodox infertility makes it sound like there's something way worse going on, which maybe there is.
Denise's comment about according to General Hospital, the embryos are created in the lab and then implanted one at a time. I think even if that's the case, there's still then the question about what about the fertilized embryos that aren't implanted? Can you dispose of them? Right? So even still, there's still that question. Or can you only fertilize one and then see if it works? And if not, then you have to go through a whole nother round of IVF in order to fertilize another embryo, right? So that's kind of, I think, the question that comes up. So there's, the fertilization separate from the implantation. Okay.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Great. Thank you.
Any other comments, thoughts, questions? Was there anything else we wanted to talk about?
Yeah. I mean, so originally, I mentioned the halachic piece at the outset. I mean, I think a lot of what, I sort of was talking with Rabbi Schatz about, maybe a direction for this conversation is the ways in which, obviously in this episode, and I think in so much of life, it's also, right, it's not so much of the halachic piece, it's much more of the social piece. And I mean, we touched on this a little bit, but the the way that kind of the shame is felt by the women more, right? It's sort of seen when couples have issues with fertility, right? Typically the assumption is that it's the problem with the woman and not the man. Societally, that's the assumption, even though medically that's not necessarily the case. I don't have statistics. I remember hearing it's about equally,
It should be, right? Because if it's a man and a woman who are having a baby, then it should be 50. Like there should be.
So I think I remember hearing that it's like 1/3 of the time it's, something shows up on the man's tests, 1/3 of the time something shows up on the woman's tests, and 1/3 of the time they don't know why, but they're having trouble. So that's what I recall hearing. I know we have doctors here who probably know more than I do on this. But again, I think it's interesting that so much of the focus here is on Amir, and then Amir ends up celebrating when he knows it's not him. And I think you sort of feel for Yifat very much because there's that assumption coming in that if there's a problem here, it must be the woman's problem, not the man's problem. So there's just a whole social dimension and dimension related to, Rabbi Schatz talked about this before a little bit, but feelings of shame, feelings of inadequacy and so forth that often are sort of born unequally, even if medically the likelihood is about equal.
Well, and I think that it goes even deeper than people who are infertile, right? As soon as, even in our community, which is a fairly liberal, we're in Los Angeles, you don't really get so much more liberal than that, maybe Northern California. But as soon as you're married, people now want to know, when are you going to get pregnant? And it's kind of stopped. I feel like my mom got it much more than my friends get it now. But as soon as you are married, people just assume it's going to be so easy. You're going to have a baby and you're going to have many babies. And when does the first one come? And when is the second one? And when is the 8th one? Right. So I think that as soon as you are married and you don't start having kids, then that's when a lot of this also comes up in terms of, well, either we're not going to talk about it or, there must be something going on with her. And the woman typically feels that. I've spoken to women in our own, not necessarily shul, but our Los Angeles community who have dealt with a lot of this, especially in the Jewish world where the little, yentas want to know, when's your first kid coming and will you name it after me? And I think that's really hard when either you're dealing with infertility or you just don't want to have to talk about the reproductive, agenda that you and your partner have.
Yeah. I thought people would have thoughts and comments. Any response to that?
Can I bring something different up just very briefly?
Yes, you may.
And that has to do with the father and his dating and the refusal of both of the sons to really have anything to do with the girlfriend.
Vera? Is that her name?
Vera. Anyway.
Yeah, it was Vera, yeah.
Vera, yeah. And putting aside her personality, but just conceptually, and I think this is a very, very real issue that lots of people, and certainly, as rabbis, we see it all the time, that, somebody dies and at a certain period of time, one can argue whether 4 months is too soon or not, but certainly a certain period of time, I've seen the same thing when it's been 4 years or even, 10 years. And the kids are just totally not willing to accept it. And sometimes the father or it could be the mother, they have to live together because the kids will not accept a remarriage.
Yeah.
But halachically speaking, one is allowed to begin dating, I believe, after 3 months.
I think that sounds right. For people who watch Shtisel, if I recall correctly, the first episode, right? Yeah, doesn't Shtisel start the first episode of the first season with the year had just finished, and now sort of immediately Shulam, the father, begins to sort of go somewhat on the prowl for, because it's ready to...
So is the reciting, does he recite Kaddish for a spouse for a year?
I think he, like you're saying, you certainly can recite Kaddish for a spouse.
Well, you can, but in terms of what's required traditionally...
What's required is only for a child. A child observes for a year.
Correct, for their parents.
For a spouse or for a sibling, it's typically... I mean, again, you can say Kaddish as long as you want, but those main customs of, things like not going to simchas and those kinds of things, that's just for a month.
Right.
Except for a child for their parent.
But I think what the tradition says is that remarriage is 3 months, just so that if there's a child that's going to be born, that the fatherhood, the parentage is clear.
Right. No, I think, yeah. I think that's...
So, and that was one of the things that was actually confusing to me with Shtisel when it started, because it was a year. And like you say, there's nothing wrong with waiting a year, but I don't think he had to wait a year.
Right. And I think it's also interesting to think about what the Halakha is getting at there. I see a couple people have their hands, so I'll call you in a second. What the Halakha is getting at with the idea that, a child is in sort of full mourning for a year versus other relations, including a spouse, is not for that full year. And I think you sort of see that play out both with Shtisel and here with Srugim, that, to use this one, okay, so like 4 months have passed, and not that he's ready to move on, but Nati's father is at least ready to sort of start a new chapter in his life. It's been 4 months, and the children are still not remotely there emotionally, and it's really, really hard for them because I think it's sort of touching on what the Halakha is getting at anyway. Of for them, it's for a whole year they can't even fathom that idea, whereas for him, after 4 months, he's like. And again, that's quicker than I think is common, but he's sort of, okay, I need a new chapter in my life now. So there is sort of that difference there, which is kind of played out in the halachic differences. Yeah. Okay, Norm, I see sort of my whole top row is up. So let's start with Norm and then we'll go across.
I think that socially, children often find it difficult to deal with a parent dating or marrying, and that the Jewish community is not an exception. And I don't really think it's a halachic issue for them. They just can't cope with it. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that point of view, but I'm also sympathetic to the parent who wants to get on with his life after a certain time. And but I don't think it's an halachic issue particularly at all. Yeah. But I know people get very upset about these things. People do crazy things.
Right. I'm saying that I think the halacha in some ways, not that it mirrors because everyone's situation is different, but it touches on something that's emotionally true, which often when we come to mourning law, people will say that the way that halacha functions sort of maps onto the ways that people grieve.
And for the 3 months, I imagine it's that a widow would need to wait 3 months to make sure about that, but chances are they would let the widower start being involved with the woman after a shorter time, like 1 month.
Right, and that might be the case. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. The one thing I want to just remind us about Halakha versus 2021 is that when people were, and this is kind of goes to Rabbi Dan Pernick's point, when people were passing away back when the Halakha was being written, they were younger. And so there was the potential for the woman to still have kids. It was definitely possible for the man to still want to have a partner, whether there were going to be kids or not, to have, a person to spend the rest of his life with. So I agree with Norm and have been in that situation with a grandparent in my own family. And I think that it's definitely hard. And at least when I hear this kind of scenario, I'm thinking of my grandfather, right? I'm not thinking of a young person who was then getting married to continue on with a family. So I just wanted to I just wanted to bring that in because I do think the halakha would potentially be different if we were talking about in 2021 when we're talking about someone who's hopefully well along in their years in life and are just looking for are looking for meaningful partnership for the end of their lives. I'm going to have to jump off, but you are in very capable hands with multiple rabbis, Pernick, and it was really lovely to see you all, and I will see you next week.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Schatz. I think Denise was next, I believe. So I'm going to call in Denise.
See you tomorrow.
So I got the sense, even before he started dating, I got the sense that Nati and Roy's dad was kind of flirty. And so, like when even
when the came over.
And even before that, but yes, he was flirty with Re'ut, and he was kind of flirty with Hodaya when she gave him tea, and he was just like, he didn't seem like a guy who just lost his wife. And it could be that she was sick for a very long time and he had already done his mourning. Mm-hmm. It could be that he's a little bit of a ladies' man, and maybe there's like a bigger picture that this is tapping into that the kids didn't like. And maybe, because like when Nadia shows up at the restaurant, Vera's like draped all over him, and it was like, what are you, 15? Like,
Yes, I also very much noticed that. That is like, she did not play that well. That is like not.
Right. And then she seemed like kind of an interesting person when she was talking about the energy and letting things out. Like, I don't know, she seemed kind of interesting, but totally not appropriate.
Not your role, not your role in that moment, very much so.
So it just made me wonder, about his backstory and how much of their feeling has to do with maybe things that went on in the past.
Yeah, I think it's something I hadn't thought about, but I think that's, really a good point, because there's sort of this dynamic where the sons, and especially Nati, are like, oh, dad is really mourning and suffering, we need to take care of him. And he's like kind of okay. And like, you think this is played out in different ways, but you're right. I forgot about, him sort of being kind of flirtatious with Re'ut, not in an inappropriate way, but in a, like, I think you're right that it might just be his personality. That's whether it's because she had been sick a long time and he had already done the grieving or whatever, or he's just worried about being alone and is sort of like, okay, I need to like get out there and start seeing people because otherwise I might get stuck and So I think there's different reasons we can imagine.
Yeah. Also, it's funny because you mentioned that the kids were like, so, oh my God, we got to take care of dad. And like, now that you say that, I think, you almost would have expected them to be relieved because none of them wanted to do it.
Right. Except they're not. Right. They're like, no, he's supposed to be sad still. And he's like, not so sad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And his emotions aren't matching theirs on this, like they're still totally in the midst, or at least Nati is still totally in the midst of grieving. And, that is kind of moving on a little bit. Okay. Yeah. Renee.
Sort of a halachic question, I guess. When within the Frum community, especially the Haredi community, the men are encouraged to marry early, partly from what I understand, so that they don't have, because they are maturing and they have sexual urges, so that they don't act on those sexual urges inappropriately. Mm-hmm. It's better that they get married earlier so that they can then. So with their father, mm-hmm. Obviously he's not, I assume he's not going to have children anymore, but is that something that is still considered with older men as well, that it's better that they find someone that they can have a relationship with or a marriage with so that they don't just fool around with anybody that's in a skirt?
It's so interesting because I think experientially, I think often there's a sense, right, he can father a child at any age, right? But I think experientially, there's sort of all of this, right, everything you're talking about when it comes to sort of that first marriage, especially, for someone who ends up having, a reasonably long-term marriage, that like you said, that focus on marrying early and all of that. The sense I have is that it changes when someone's a widower, and maybe this is different in the modern Orthodox world versus in the Haredi world. But at least in the modern Orthodox world, from what I've seen, there's sort of, it seems like, once someone's a widower, it's a little bit like, okay, like not everything's out the window, but suddenly no one's asking those questions. There's not those same, like, people don't treat it as strange if they're together and not married, if the man's with a woman and they're not married, and they sort of seem to be publicly together. Like, all these things seem to change after, like, with older men. And it might be that there's an assumption like, okay, they already did their mitzvah, they did pru urvu, and so, like, we're not so worried about, because ultimately the concern about zera levatala, about spilling seed, comes from a concern that will be in lieu of having children, right? That's really what the concern comes from. So it might be, even though, as Debbie / Steve say, he can father a child at any age, there's also often a sense of like, okay, they've had their kids. Like, he's not likely to want to have more kids. Even if he was still married to his first wife, probably would not be having any more kids. So we sort of, not that we don't care as much, but there's not as much of an emphasis or a focus on it. Even though halakhically, like, that might not actually be something that, like, maybe we should be caring about that, but I just think experientially it seems that that's not the case.
Right. Funny little story associated with that is that I did mishloach manots for some of the elderly in our community. And I went to deliver it to this one woman, and a gentleman opened the door for me, and he called her, and we started conversing, and she was European, and they're from the same country my mom was from. And then she tells me, the guy that opened the door for you, he's not my husband. My husband died 20 years ago, but it's okay because we're not having kids anymore. The woman, by the way, was 96 years old. I thought it was the cutest thing ever. But she felt like even in this day and age, and even with her age, she had to clarify to me that she was not living totally in sin because they're not planning on having kids.
It's so interesting. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, Mom. Just unmute yourself.
Yes. Yep. So I think, just going back to Nati, I think he's jealous of his father. I think he's jealous that his father's able to move on because he's stuck and he's not able to mourn properly and get past it. And I think he's jealous that his father is able to develop relationships that he's not able to. He just has a lot of trouble with relationships. So I think he's just jealous of his father.
Always good to get a round of applause from Dad. But I think you're right. There's a sense of like, no, he's supposed to be really struggling, and like I think so much, right? The sort of the next level nature of Nati in this episode, like he had been clearly struggling before, but it's like clearly elevated a lot of notches in this episode, and I think that is a huge part of it, right? Is that well, everyone else, even my dad who just lost my mom, he can now develop a relationship and he's okay. And like, I'm still not. I think I think that's very, and seeing everyone else, and everyone else is doing okay and, all of that. And, I think that's a huge piece.
Everyone's having a relationship but me.
Everyone's having a relationship with me. Yeah. Right. And even, my old dad is, suddenly seen as desirable and I'm still not. Like, what's going on here? So good point, Mom. Thank you. Jeff, were you going to say something? I see Michael and Sue have their hands.
Well, I was just going to take another shot at my favorite character, Nati. It's covered pretty well, I think, by Norm and others too about as far as father's relationships go. I just think he can't even get along with the lady clown in the hospital very well.
Right,
so, I had medical students like that. Some, not very many, fortunately, but I had a few, and especially the early years. So I had very little sympathy for Nati at all.
Medical students who couldn't get along with, you're saying with like...
Well, their social say skills hadn't developed.
I see. Yeah. It's, right. It's like, it's not, and I get that he's sort of like, just like, I'm not like, head down, I'm just like powering through this and like leave me alone, get out of the way. And she's like clown, but he's like so obnoxious to her, like so incredibly obnoxious to her. And also look, frankly, like it's not easy being a medical clown because you're in a setting where you're like clearly different, and right, that's also part of the job, but like you stand out. And so it makes a huge difference for a medical clown to feel like they're being supported and their work is seen as valued by the medical team. And so having this, resident come in and just totally dismiss her utility entirely is just like, yeah.
But then when does he value her?
When she's suddenly attractive. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's like, oh, you're actually pretty. Like, okay, never. Yeah, I'm waiting for. Yeah, he has difficulty laughing. Yeah, I'm waiting for that relationship to develop. We'll see. I haven't seen it yet. I'm waiting for that. Okay, Sue Ray.
All right, I was going to say, I think Nati would have been more responsive also to the woman had she not been such a floozy or whatever, how she was acting, and then to say, here she'd been divorced. It's a difference in divorce and a widow. And just the things she said, and just should have been more reserved and laid back.
Yeah. No, I certainly, and I think that point about the difference between a divorcee and a widow is like a really important one also. And I think that's, sort of why it comes up. Obviously, there are many widows who marry divorcees, but there's, often it's sort of a different type of, right? It's just you're dealing with different kinds of things.
Yes.
So, yeah, she's certainly, right, her being draped all over him, her making comments, trying to sort of almost parent Nati, like that. Don't do that. There's just a lot of things she does wrong. Nati obviously doesn't handle it well. Yeah, they made her French. I noticed that as well. Yeah. She's very French, which is kind of to go with Jeff's background there. But so she doesn't handle it well, but obviously Nati also very much doesn't handle it well. So, okay, a few hands. I know Michael had his hand up. I see my dad has his hand up. I see Leonard has his hand up.
Just, I guess I'm more reiterating at this point, Josh, but the Nadi's dad's girlfriend, I think, is terrible. And I think his dad was totally insensitive. And the way granted, Nadi has a lot negatively on his plate. We know that. And I'm hardly the greatest defender of Nadi, but in this particular, the father has no empathy with the fact that Nadi is still going through enormous emotional grief. The girlfriend, I like your word floozy, the girlfriend has no business going after him at all. She's a total stranger. And to treat Nadi as a 10-year-old was just, I basically found her close to despicable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sorry, but I do.
Yeah, she's just French,
Was she supposed to be French and not Israeli? I mean, Jewish, yes, but
no, she's
a French Jew.
French Israeli, but her Hebrew is very heavily French accent. And my best friend from college is French.
And she even threw in French words and stuff.
Yeah, she threw in French words, exactly. Yeah, so. Yeah, definitely. Okay, Leonard.
Also a stereotype of what some Israelis think French Jews are like.
Well, that could be
not
too.
Very fair.
Yeah, that could be as well. Okay, Leonard.
So you were talking about, it's not uncommon for older people to remarry after they lose their spouses. So I was just wondering, is a Cohen allowed to marry a widow?
Only of a Kohen.
Thank you, Dad. A Cohen can marry the widow of a Kohen.
Okay, because I was going to wonder if it's better for them to live together not being married or for him to marry her against the rules.
Yeah.
What about gay Cohens like Andy Cohen of Hollywood?
Yeah, that's a whole different. No, right?
Can a Cohen be gay?
A Cohen cannot marry a divorcee or a convert, or I guess typically a widow, unless it was a widow of a Cohen, which I don't know if I actually knew that. So thank you, Dan. So that good question.
I just wanted to contrast here. We have Nati's father wanting to introduce his girlfriend to his family, to his sons, and then you have Asaf not wanting to introduce Hodaya to his family. So it's a contrast of those two.
Thank you. Yeah, for bringing that. I love how you always like bring in those connections. You're right. Yeah, and I think, truthfully, I think Nati's dad recognizes that this is not a simple thing that he's doing, right? And he does kind of keep pushing it. Like, I want you guys to meet Vera, right? We sort of see that at the beginning of the episode where he's, they're on the phone and he's like, so, I think he, right. And he even, when was it last episode or the episode before, when he sort of walks out of Nati's apartment and then comes back and says like, okay, I need you to know, like, I'm seeing someone. Like, he clearly understands that this is not a simple thing, but he also wants his sons to be supportive, and they are not, at least, I think both, but in different ways, right? Roi is just more avoidance, okay, I'll be there, and he doesn't show. Nati shows and then, is obnoxious. So they sort of handle their strong discomfort in different ways. But you're right, it's very different than Asaf, who doesn't want to introduce her, and like, there's sort of different complicated family dynamics at play. But you're right, there's like, that isn't a notable contrast for sure. Right. I thought there was someone else who had their hand up also, but Norm, your hand is up according to the screen.
Yeah, because I really thought Vera nailed Nati on the head exactly. I thought her description of him was exactly right.
Oh, yeah.
He behaved, you say you shouldn't treat him like a 10-year-old. Well, he behaved like a 10-year-old. It was really terrible. But in the other case, it was particularly a problem for Hodaya to me because she was not telling her family yet that she was no longer from, and she'd been very worried about them discovering. We saw that in previous episodes.
Right.
And so she should have been understood that he might be in a very similar situation. And so if she's going to intervene at all, she should do something to make it look like she's somebody that they would approve of and that he would appreciate that, which she utterly failed to do.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what bothered me so much about her in that scene is she's coming in with her short skirt and short sleeves, and she goes and starts rubbing his cheek and all that stuff, which is like, for this person who was so nervous about her booby, seeing her with pants that she didn't stop her in the street, right? Like, where did that sensibility go when it comes to other people, right? So, yeah, completely agree on that. Okay.
Can I say something about Hodaya?
Yes, please, Denise.
So I felt like, because they don't communicate about these things verbally in a direct way, I felt like part of her demeanor and the whole thing surrounding Asaf and his family and his stress and everything, and then coming home with the yarmulke, which I thought was actually very cute. On the subtitles, she said kippah, and they translated it as yarmulke, which I thought was really cute. But he was so dismissive to her at every step of the way, as in terms of like, oh, I'm like really experienced at being Chiloni and you're just a newcomer. And but it wasn't like it like really, really irksome to me that it just so dismissive, so just disrespectful, not in any way honoring just that she has her journey, not having any empathy for her. And so it's like, you at Tu Brute, you, Mr. Chiloni shrimp living with women in Tel Aviv, right. You are saying to Hillel with a yarmulke, like, give me a break,
and
because
saying,
he would have totally made fun of her if she showed any tension around her family, or he would have laughed in her face. He would have no respect for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the name of the episode, I'm forgetting what it was exactly, but it touched on that kind of like divine involvement. I forget if it was like Hitar Vut Elokit or something. It was something like that, the title of the episode, which I played at the beginning. And it's sort of like, yeah, you sort of see that. And I don't think for him it's just the show for his family. I think that's primarily, but he comes back and he says, I forget how they translated it, but he says in Hebrew, it was an effing nace, right?
Yeah.
He's like this Mr. Chiloni is like, no, but this is like a nace. This is like really a miracle, right? So he, suddenly that bad boy Chiloni like is not coincidental that he's wearing a kippah anymore.
It reminded me that there's a thing from World War I where they used to say like there are no atheists in foxholes.
Yeah.
Because atheism was like up and coming at that time.
Right.
And,
Yeah, no, completely. That's the same idea. Does that stay? I like to tell the story when I worked at, maybe I'll finish with the story. When I worked at a summer camp, I went with two friends to like an amusement park, and we got there like first thing, right as the amusement park opened. And then when we finished the first ride, and suddenly my friend who drove us there couldn't find his car keys. And they'd flown out of his pocket on this ride. And we went to the people below, and they're like, that ride covers 3 square miles. There's swamps. They said, we mow the lawn twice a week, but like, if it's in there, whatever, it'll show up in a few days. And I remember that friend, like, who wasn't religious. It was a Jewish camp. He wasn't religious. And suddenly he's like, okay, but God, like, if you make the keys show up, and his parents were out of town, they were like in Michigan. He's like, if you make the keys show up, I'll go to davening every morning and write all these things. And then of course the keys, ended up flying from the ride onto the walking path, and someone turned them in, and we found them, and like he did not continue to go to Minyan after that, right? Like, which is the typical story. There's a million variations of it, but yeah, the question I think then is like, is this actually going to create a change in him? Because sometimes it does. Or is this going to be like, it was a nace, this is incredible, and then I'm going to go back to being who I was? I think that's sort of one of the storylines that we'll have to see. It's becoming pretty interesting. So lots of storylines to see what direction they go in. But I think we'll call it here for the nights. So thank you all for joining and for sticking around even a little bit late.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rabbi. Appreciate it.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.